I'm sorry if you had showed up yesterday for the Aesop's Fables class. I had to cancel it because I forgot that one of my kids had a surgery scheduled for yesterday that I forgot about. I canceled the class and hopefully you got an email, but that's all I could do is get that email out. I couldn't, there's no other way for me to communicate that at the time. All right, so 12:57. Today, I'd like to talk about vocabulary, Latin vocabulary. So, if you're studying Latin vocabulary, if you've been working on that, let me know what lesson you're working on in the chat. If you've been studying vocabulary. If not, it's okay. But if you have been studying vocabulary, let me know what lesson you're on. James asks, how do I submit a handwritten translation assignment? Um, James, yes or no? Do you have access to like a smartphone, iPhone or Android phone? Maybe like if you don't have one, your parents have one. No. Um, well, obviously you have access to a webcam, right? Because you're on a camera right now. So you can probably just take a picture of it. If you can get a decent picture of it, usually your webcam can also act like a camera. You can just, I mean, you can like literally hold a piece of paper up in front of your camera like this and take a picture of it, right? So if you get a picture, just don't submit the picture on the assignment box on the study center. Just email it to us or create a ticket and submit a picture of it. And then in the lesson assignment, where it asks you for your answers, just type I submitted my assignment by email. Okay. And then if we're grading your assignment, we can just go check the email real quick, find your assignment and grade it. So that's okay. Got that? Does that make sense? The reason I asked if you had a phone is if you have a smartphone or if your parents have a smartphone, there's an app called Adobe Scan, and you can just scan your paper. It turns it into a PDF file, and then you can submit the PDF file, which is really easy. But if you want to submit a file like that, I recommend you just submit it by email and then just enter in the assignment box, I submitted my assignment by email. We really don't care. We want you to get your assignments done more than anything. It's like it's not like if a student submits a picture of an assignment, I don't like fall out of my chair and roll around on the floor, I'm happy you got your work done. The only problem is that as a student or as the study center goes, there's only, using up storage space for images can get crazy because sometimes you can take a picture and it's like 2 MB of data space, and those things add up quickly. So we may just have to require everybody to delete all the assignments that they've submitted, like photos and stuff like that. So it's just by emailing it, it keeps it off the study center, so we don't have to worry about that. Yeah, another option, like Mrs. Michael just wrote, Cecilia is providing us with a link to her document. There are lots of options. It really doesn't matter. You can use Google Docs to complete an assignment and then just paste a link to your Google Doc in the assignment box. That's fine. You can upload a file somewhere online. Like, there are different places where you can upload a file. Like you can upload a file to Google Drive if you have a Google Drive account and then just give us a link. That's better than posting a picture or something like that. But at the same time, for me, if you want me to grade assignments quickly, just entering your answers in the answer boxes is the fastest way for me to grade. So it's up to you. If you can't do that, there's other ways, but if you can just get your answers into the answer boxes, that's actually what makes for the fastest grading. Okay. If you want me to have to set out on a, 2-week journey to your house to pick up a piece of paper, that's just going to slow down grading. So, all right, 1 o'clock. Looks like folks are still coming in here. We've got just about 30. There's close to 50 registered, so I'm sure that there are some in other time zones waiting for the wrong hour to get started, but we're going to get started here in a minute. Yeah, so the main lesson there, James, is just get your assignment to us. We can always work on finding better ways to do it in the future, but the most important thing is to get your work turned in. I tried to turn my camera, but it says that I can't. Cecilia, sometimes the camera, and your computer just act funny. Sometimes you just need to restart your computer and it kind of cleans everything out and gets everybody organized. So if you want to take a minute and restart your computer, you can do that. If not, you can just ignore it. Today, we're actually not going to do a Bible passage. We went over Latin reading last week, and I think that most of you learned how to do the translation exercises because the work that was turned in this past week was good. So I could tell that students learned what to do and then went and did it. So that was good. Today, I'd like to look at the vocabulary course. So we're going to look at vocab. All right, 103. So I'm going to get started here. What I'd like to do today, like I said, is talk about the Latin vocabulary course and just talk about Latin studies a little bit in general, because I want you as students to be motivated and to have a clue why you should devote yourself to Latin studies. It's common for students to not really know why their parents are trying to get them to study Latin. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit because, if you don't know, I was a classicist, so was my wife, which means we actually went to college and studied Latin and Greek. And a lot of people don't know why you would do that, especially if you want to make a living. Why would you go study Latin? But it's misleading, actually. Back 2 or 3 generations ago, no one was considered educated unless they had studied classics, whereas nowadays schools like to focus on math and science, and students don't actually learn the classics. And I think long term it has a negative effect because classical studies are helpful in the long run. And it's really not that hard to prepare for professional studies. But once you get into professional studies, when you finish college or whatever, you've got to be successful in life. And to be successful in life requires a lot more than knowing how to solve math problems or knowing some facts or trivia about different scientific subjects. So it's good to have a general education, and Latin studies are an important part of that education because our language comes from Latin and Greek. So if you don't know Latin and Greek, you never really have a grasp of the English language. It's like trying to do addition and subtraction problems without ever learning the numbers. You can mess around with it and maybe you'll get some answers right once in a while by luck, but you'll never really understand what you're doing. So the study of Latin and Greek is really important as a foundation for English studies, for your language in general. And in this vocabulary course, we'll see that really clearly. And what I'd like to do today is walk you through a couple lessons in vocabulary and just show you how this vocabulary radically changes your ability to read English. Because what it means to be literate, when we talk about people being literate, it doesn't mean that you can read easy stuff. It doesn't mean that you can read, Dr. Seuss or children's books and things like that. What literate means is that you can read something that's mature. You can read something that's written by adults, for adults, written by experts in different fields. who have high levels of language and you can understand it. That's what it means to be literate, right? So it doesn't matter if you go to the store and you go to the children's section and get children's books, or go to the library and you read age appropriate book. That's not what it means to be literate. Being literate means you can enter into adult society. You can talk with experts in different fields. You can read things they write. You can get information and research to solve problems you have. And you're not going to be held up by the language. The language is not going to get in the way. That's really what it means to be literate. And so studying Latin and Greek, you can learn one Latin word that helps you to understand 20 English words. And you can learn one Greek word that helps you to understand a dozen English words. And it's just a much more efficient way of learning language. So that's the real, one of the most important benefits of Latin studies. Of course, for Catholics, we have practical uses of Latin. It's one thing to go to a Latin mass and sit there and say, wow, this is really neat. I think Latin sounds cool. Well, okay, that's nice, but it would be much better to go to the Latin mass and actually understand what's being said, or to sing a Latin hymn and know what it actually means, rather than just saying all these crazy words because they sound pretty when you sing them. So as Catholics, we want to be comfortable with Latin. We want to be able to say a prayer or sing a hymn or attend a mass and understand what the words mean. And then thirdly, if you get into any real studies, any historical studies, or if you're interested in philosophy or theology in the future, there's a lot of stuff you need to read that isn't translated into English. And if you can't read Latin, if you can't read Greek, even other languages like French and German, Italian, Spanish, if you can't read other languages, it's like going into sports with only one arm. There's only so much you can do. There are certain positions you can't play because you only have one arm. And the same thing is true with languages. If you're able to read, and I don't mean speak different languages, because speaking languages is not necessarily important. And I think people put too much emphasis on learning to speak languages. I can read Italian, I can read French, I can read a little bit of German, but I can't speak Italian or French. I can't go to France and have a conversation, but I don't need to, because that's not why I study the language. I want to be able to read something written in French if I have to. And we have to develop a reading knowledge of these languages, which is very different, much easier than a speaking knowledge of these languages. So the more languages we can read, the more sources we can study, the deeper our studies can go, the broader our studies can go. So the more time we can spend on language, the better. So I'd like to walk through this vocabulary course today and show you how to study vocabulary. So I'm going to share my screen here. Just give me a minute. Give me a wave if you can see my screen, a black and white page on the screen. Good, thank you. Let me zoom this in a little bit. Okay, so in the Latin vocabulary course, this is a course that was written back in the 15 or 1600s, a book that was written back then. This was the first picture book ever made in history. This Latin book here, it's a book called Orbis Sensualium Pictu. It was written by a Protestant schoolmaster, which shouldn't get us scared, because it's not like we're learning theology in this book. Remember, the printing press was invented in the 1400s. It was the first time books really began to be printed for students. Before then, when kids went to school, they didn't have books. They didn't go to school with arms loaded with textbooks and backpacks filled with books. Usually students went to class, and the only person who had a book was the teacher. And the teacher would read the book to the students, and the students would usually take notes to write down the content of the book. That's why class lessons are called lectures. If I asked you, what does the word lecture mean? Most of you would say it means to speak, but that's not what lecture means. Lecture means to read. It comes from the Latin verb legere, which means to read. So a lecture meant a reading, because the teacher was the only one who had the book. And the books had to be handwritten. So you can imagine what a mess it was to try to get a book back in those days. Then the printing press came out, was developed in the 1400s. and books started to be printed. So once books started to be printed, let me fix one thing real quick. I think I see I'll fix it later. Anyway, I think I can let you turn your camera on. Yeah, okay. If you couldn't turn your camera on, you should be able to now. Sorry about that. What I was saying was when the printing press came out, all of a sudden we had this new opportunity to make books for students. So for the first time really in history, this idea of having school books developed in the 1500s. And this Latin vocabulary book was the first picture book ever made for children to use and study. So it's an important historical book, and it shows us how the Latin was taught back in the 1500s. So it's an important book for us to have for our language studies, but also for history studies, to learn about the history of education. What we have here in this book, for every lesson, you can see lesson 1, and then you see that there's an English title, invitation, and then you see there's a Latin title, invitatio. So for every chapter, we have a topic in this vocabulary book, and then we have a picture, and these pictures aren't crystal clear. Remember, we're dealing with first picture books that were ever printed. We have a picture that sort of shows us the things that are talked about in the lesson. So if you want to look at the pictures, you can start to identify the names that we learn in the lesson with what you see in the picture. That's how the lesson is designed to work. You'll also see in some lessons, I'll scroll down to another lesson here, just a second. You'll see in other lessons, not this one, this one. If you look carefully, again, it's hard to see sometimes, but if you look carefully, you'll see that there are numbers actually in the picture, and then there are numbers in the lesson that mark those things. So you can actually take the vocabulary words, see the number, and then go find the number in the picture, and that object that's named will be numbered. Again, these pictures aren't, this isn't 21st century, technology here. They had to carve these pictures into wood, put them into the printing press, cover them with ink, and then press the paper on them. So you can imagine you're not going to get very clear pictures, but it's better than nothing. And like I said, this was the first picture book ever made. So what we're going to do is walk through these lessons and learn this vocabulary, and then talk about the vocabulary a little bit so that we can get the benefit of understanding how it affects English language and things like that. So think of it as a Latin vocabulary course, but in our meetings, it'll also be an English vocabulary course. So we'll work on a bunch of stuff. And every other week or 2 weeks, we'll do a vocabulary lesson together after we go through the Latin reading, okay? So let's go ahead and start with lesson 1 up here, the invitatio. And what I'd like to do, I asked my wife, because she works with younger students, I asked her what would be helpful, and she said that it would be helpful for the kids to just hear the Latin. So pronunciation becomes easy, and it makes it easier to study. So what I'd like to do is just read through the Latin lesson and then walk through it and help you understand how to study it. And we'll just move through as fast as we can. And if you have any questions about the vocabulary, you're free to ask them. If I see them come in on the chat, I'll stop and answer them. And then afterwards, at the end of class, we can, anything you'd like to talk about these things, we can talk about. Okay, so lesson 1, we have the topic is invitation. The Latin is invitatio, and we're going to use Christian pronunciation in this course because it's Christian writing. So invitatio, or invitation to the course. And we have a picture here of 2 people. There's a man and a boy. And you can see that in the title of the lesson, we read the master and the boy. So we've got a schoolmaster or teacher and a boy, a student. And then we have here the Latin, magister et puer, magister et puer. So we can see that in Latin, this word magister is translated as master. That's where the word master comes from, magister. And puer is the Latin word for boy. So for example, with English vocabulary, I'll type this in the chat. If we come across a word in English, puerile, okay, or puerile, and I say, you're acting puerile, What does that mean? What does that English word mean? Obviously, you've never seen it before, but you might come across it in reading. It means you're acting like a child, right? Okay. And so you can see if you came across that in reading, you'd have no idea what that word means. We don't use it in everyday English language, but if you study Latin, you'd say, oh, I know what that means. It means you're acting like a boy, you're acting like a child. Okay. So that's how the Latin vocabulary helps us. But we got these two words, magister and puer. Now, let me ask you this. In Catholic teaching, we talked about this in our sacred scripture class. We talk about the magisterium. Well, look at the Latin word magister and then think about magisterium. What does the word magisterium mean? What does it really mean? You can chat me the answer. What is the magisterium? Yeah, it's master, but sometimes master is confusing because we think like slave and master. That's not what master means here. What does magisterium mean based on this word magister? Good, teacher, okay? It means masters if you know that master refers to teachers, but don't think of master and slave. That's a different idea of master, okay? But magister and puer means the teacher and the boy, all right? And then in this lesson, we've got a discussion between the master and the boy. Yes, schoolmaster, that's the idea. Very good. So then we've got in this lesson a discussion between the master and the boy. And of course, if you're just learning Latin, you have no idea what this means. And that's okay, because the English translation is over here on the other side, and you can figure it out. Human beings are pretty clever. Students will complain that it's hard, but I know that kids are capable of doing lots of hard things when they want to, So we have the Latin, and then on the other side, we have the English, and it just takes some common sense to figure out what the Latin words mean when the translation is written right next to them. So the magister says, veni puer disce sapere. Veni puer disce sapere. And then over here we have the translation. So the first word, veni, is a command. The magister says to the puer, veni. That means come. So come. And you probably know that word because at Christmas time we sing Venite adoremus, and that hymn is come, let us adore him, right? Venite adoremus. Venite is plural. So if I was talking to a bunch of people, I would say venite, which means come. But veni is singular because the magister is talking to one boy. Yeah, veni, Emmanuel, same thing. O come, Emmanuel. Very good. All right. So once we see the Latin word, if you just stop and think about it, you can probably think of places you've heard this or English words where you've seen this. So my advice is, don't think you're supposed to look at a word and immediately know its meaning. That's really not how it works. Look at a word and then ask yourself, where have I seen that word before? Or what word can I think of where that word was a part of the word? Because it makes it pretty easy. Very good. Veni vidi vici means I came, I saw, I conquered, right? Now, let me just say this real quick because two of you posted that veni vidi vici. That veni in that sentence is different than veni in this sentence. Veni here in our vocabulary lesson is a command. It means come. Veni in that quote from Julius Caesar, it's a past tense verb that means I came. It's past tense. Veni, I came. Vidi, I saw. Vici, I conquered. So they're the same words, but they're actually two different forms that are used for different things. So, but good though. If you knew that, you could guess intelligently at what this word means. So veni means come. Puer, boy. Disce means learn. So we can see that the translation is pretty simple. Now, you look at this word disce, that's the Christian pronunciation. Disce would be classical pronunciation. And you look at this word and you look at what's called the stem or the core of the word and ask yourself, where have I seen that in English? And don't think like compact disc, right? Just because the words match up. Think beyond that, right? So where have I seen DISC? Discipline, that's good. Let's think of another one. What's another one? Jesus said, go into the world and make what? Discern, that's good. Disciple, good. So dishe is the verb that means to learn. Okay, so a disciple is a person who learns. A student is a disciple. Disciple just means a learner. So the teacher says to the boy, hey, become my disciple, be my disciple. Dishe, learn. And then he says, sapere. Sapere means to be wise. We see this whole phrase, to be wise. That's the translation of sapere, to be wise. So we have a simple phrase there, 4 or 5 words. We can see the English translation. If you're lazy and fussy, you complain, oh, this is hard, I can't figure it out. But if you just take a few minutes and look at it and think about what the possible words refer to in the Latin, it's pretty easy to figure it out. So veni puer disce sapere, come boy, learn to be wise. So come, follow me, be my disciple, the master says to the boy. And then the boy responds and says, quid hoc est sapere, quid hoc est. Now, notice we have a question mark at the end of the sentence, so we have a question. And this first word that begins with a Q, and you'll see this is true for many Q words, this first word is the question word. What does quid mean? Who knows what quid means? It's a question. What does quid mean? What? Very good. All right. So quid hoc est. The boy asks, quid hoc est. Hoc means this, and est means is. Now, the translation is a little funky because it's older English, right? But we can figure that out. It's not too hard. So quid is translated what? Hoc is translated this. The word orders changed around a little bit just to make it more comfortable English. And then the word doth, the old English word doth, means is or does. What does this mean? Quid hoc est sapere. And here you can see that the word sapere, if you look carefully, I don't know how clearly you can see this, but you'll see that the word sapere is in italics letters. It's in slanted letters. That means that it's a key word in this vocabulary lesson. We also see that magister and puer are in italics. We see sapere is in italics. And then if we look over to the English, we'll see that the phrase to be wise is in italics. That's the real key vocabulary for this lesson. So you can learn a lot by looking at all the words in the lesson, but really the most important thing is to learn the vocabulary items that are set in italics. They're the real focus of the lesson, all right? So the boy asks, quid hoc est sapere? And then the magister answers and explains to him what it means to be wise. The first thing he says is intelligere recte. Intelligere recte. That's the first thing of what it means to be wise. Intelligere, you can obviously think of English words that come from this Latin words. Give me some if you think of them. Intelligent, intelligence, intellectual, right? If you hear that someone is an intellectual, what does that mean? What is an intellectual in English? A person who is intelligent, right? A person who studies, good, an intellectual. Intelligere means to understand. You can see the translation there. And then recte, recte means rightly. Recte means rightly. Okay, so intelligere recte. Rectify means to make right. Very good. Okay. A rectangle is a geometrical figure that's made of right angles, right? Right can also mean straight, but same root. So you know, thinking of the vocabulary and how it helps your English takes just some effort, right? If you're lazy and don't think about it, you won't learn these lessons. But if you just take some time to think, sometimes there are some games that we play like puzzle games where you might be given like 6 letters and you're asked how many words you can think of that can be spelled with these 6 letters. You can sort of do the same thing with vocabulary. You can take a Latin word like recte or intelligere or veni or disce and think, how many English words can I think of that come from this Latin word? So it's a good exercise, and that's really how you build your vocabulary. And then when you're reading in English, and you come across a word you don't you have to stop. Don't just be lazy and say, oh, I don't know what that word means. As you study Latin and Greek, hopefully, you can look at a word and say, look, I don't know what that word means, but I can figure out what it might mean. And then I can look in the context and see if that makes sense. And I can keep reading and understand. That's how you're supposed to learn how to read. That's called figuring out vocabulary in context, right? If I read something, even at my age, I don't know what every word that I see means, but I can figure it out what it means based on the overall context of the passage. So you have to learn to be literate, and that's what it means to be literate. All right. So the first thing is intelligere recte, intelligere recte, and pronunciation is going to be hard. Like, how do I know to say intelligere and not intelligere or intelligere? How do I know how to pronounce this? Well, you have to study grammar to learn how to pronounce things. So if you're working through the Latin grammar course, there's lessons on pronunciation that explain how to figure that stuff out. So you've got to study all these courses, right? It's just a commitment to learn the language. So the first part is intelligere recte, to understand rightly. Then he goes on in the second page here, agere recte. So here's the second thing, agere recte. And agere is translated to do, agere recte. Now, if you take this stem agere, we can think of an English word like agile, right? Or agility. What do you think agile means in English? If agere means to do in Latin, agere means to do, what does agile mean? Agile. And we can see the word is ag, which comes from this Latin word, and then we have the ile ending, which means ability. So George got it. George says the ability to move or do stuff. That's what agile means. Okay. So if you're sort of a clumsy person who can barely walk, and if you walk across the lawn, you trip over a stick, you're not very agile. Whereas, when you look at like a Navy SEAL or somebody like that who can swim, climb, jump, run, do all these different things, or a gymnast or a professional athlete, you say, wow, they're really agile. It's because they can do lots of different things. All right, comes from the word agere, to do recte. However, to do is not a very good translation for agere, because what it means is to act rightly, to act. And the word act actually comes from this verb agere. So to understand things rightly or to think rightly, agere recte means to act rightly, to actually behave rightly. And then lastly, eloquui recte. Eloquui recte means to speak rightly. So if I take the English word, if I say, I love listening to this person because he is very eloquent. Very good, George. Eloquent means to speak well. It comes from the verb eloquui or eloquere, which means to speak. And then we have omnia necessaria, omnia necessaria. So to understand rightly, to act rightly, and to speak rightly, omnia necessaria, all things that are necessary. Omnia is translated all, and necessaria is translated necessary. That are is added in there. You know how in Latin reading, we said you can add words to make the translation clearer, but put them in parentheses? Those words that are would be put in parentheses if we were writing the translation, okay? So to understand rightly, to act rightly, to speak rightly, all things that are necessary. That's what it means to be wise, the Magister says. And then the puer asks, quis docebit me hoc? Quis docebit me hoc? And notice we have another question word that starts with a Q, another one of these Q question words, quis, and we see it translated as who. So we've got two different words we've learned so far, quid and quis. Quid was translated what? Quis is translated who. Quis docebit me? Docebit is translated will teach. Who will teach? So docebit, we see the verb to teach. And who can think of some English words that are drawn from this this verb docebit. We have the stem here, doce. Doce is the stem. It means to teach. Who can think of something? Docile, very good. What does docile mean? What does docile mean? Teachable, very good. Okay. George says doctor, not like doctor as a medical doctor, but doctor as a teacher of the church. That's what it means to be a doctor. Dogmatic, yeah, we're kind of close there, but not really. Docent, that's good. What does docent mean? I actually just talked about that with my wife yesterday. What does docent mean? That word doce in Portuguese actually comes from the Latin word dulce. You know, if you ever pray the Salve Regina in Latin, you know, we refer to the Virgin Mary as dulcis. Dulcis means sweet. Doce in Portuguese there actually comes from dulcis. Yeah, very good. Docent or docent means one who is teaching, like someone who leads you through an art museum and explains things. Good. All right, so good. So those words, we can think about it and think of English words that come from this verb docebit. Quis docebit me hoc? Who shall teach me this? Who will teach me this? The boy asks. And then the magister responds and says, ego. Ego means I. I will teach you. Ego. Now, in English, this word ego comes into English when we say someone has an ego problem. We say, oh, I don't like that kid. He has an ego problem. What does it mean to have an ego problem? It comes from this word. What does it mean to have an ego problem? Think about it. What is an ego problem? To be self-centered. Good, right? All you think about is I. You've got an I problem, right? You're self-centered. So that's what it means to be egocentric. Yeah, to think about yourself too much, to think about I all the time. Alter ego, Lara wrote, or alter ego. Alter ego means another me, another self. It's like I'm like two different people. I have an alter ego. Okay. Good. So ego or ego, I should say. Ego means I. Cum Deo. Cum Deo. And you've got a stinky translation because it's translated by God's help. But that's really not what we see here in the Latin. We see cum Deo. Who knows what cum Deo means? Cum Deo. Yeah, good. John got that. George, good. Lara, good. So cum Deo means with God. So what the Magister actually says is, I will teach you cum Deo, with God. That is God helping me. Okay, cum Deo. You can see that's a Latin phrase that means God helping me. So if you say, you know, hey, Mr. Michael, can you help me with my math work? I can say, sure, cum Deo, right? With God helping me, with God's help. Okay, cum Deo, with God. Ego cum Deo. Then he asks, the puer asks another question. We see another one of these Q question words, quo modo. Quo modo. And we see it translated how, which is kind of a funky translation. Quo modo, it's really a combination of two words, quo and modo. And what it means is in what way? That's what it means. Quo modo, in what way will you do this? So it's translated how, which means the same thing. But I want you to see that in the Latin there, it's in what way? Quo modo, in what way? How will you teach me these things? And then the Magister says, ducam te per omnia. Ducam te per omnia. Ducam, I will guide. So ducam is translated, I will guide. Te is you or the. Per means through. And you can see just a funny old spelling of through. And then omnia means all things. So I shall lead you through all things. I'll show you everything. All right. Look at this word ducam. We see this stem, duc. It means to guide. So who can think of some English words that are derived from this Latin word duc, which means to guide? Can you think of any? Once you think of one, you'll think of 20. So think about it. What can we think of? A duke is a leader. That's good. That comes from this word. That's definitely true. Let's think of some English words that D-U-C. Think of some English words that have D-U-C in the English word, because most of them will come from Dukam. How about, I'll give you some here to help you. How about introduce? Introduce. Conduct is good. Introduce. Introduce means to lead people together, right? So you walk into a party and you bring a friend with you and you see another one of your friends and you want these two friends to get to know each other. So you introduce them, you lead them together, you lead them to know one another, all right? A conductor, Josh Pelletier wrote a train conductor. I think somebody else wrote conduct. A conductor is someone who leads things together, right? Con means together. So it's the person who kind of brings everything together. I think it's a little easier to understand if we think about a music conductor, right? Standing in front of the orchestra, and he's got all these different individual musicians with all their different instruments, and the conductor, he trains and works with them and leads them to play together. He's the conductor. He conduces the orchestra. Produce, that's another good one. It means to lead forth, right? To produce something means to lead it to grow. So for example, if I go out into the garden and I produce fruit, I work to lead that fruit forth, right? To produce it. Good, productive. Once you realize that the stem duc comes from this Latin verb ducere, which means to lead, you'll start thinking of 20 different English words, right? Induce, when a woman is pregnant and her due date is passing, the doctors can induce her labor. What does induce mean? What does induce mean? The doctors can induce her labor. Adel, that's good. Aqueduct is another one. What does induce? Reduce is another one. That's good. What does induce mean? The doctors can induce labor. What does that mean? Come on, give me a couple guesses here, and then we'll move on. Induce labor. Mom is pregnant, the baby's due, the due date passes, the doctor can induce labor, right? He can lead it on. He can lead it on, okay? He can lead it on usually by using some medicines to do that, to make labor start. Good. All right, so anyway, we see this stem duc, and once we realize it means to lead, we can start thinking of all kinds of English words that come from that word. And like I said, you can learn one Latin word, and that can unlock the meaning of dozens of English words that you may have never seen before. That's how it helps. So the master says, I will guide you through all things. And then he says, ostendam tibi omnia. Ostendam tibi omnia. We're told ostendam means I will show. I will show. Tibi means to you. Okay, tibi, you see te up here means you. Tibi here really means to you. I will show to you omnia, all things. Let's look at this word ostendam. Ostendam. If you are studying Theophrastus's characters, one of the characters is the ostentatious. So real quick, I don't know if any of you are actually on that lesson. Very good, George. You're ahead of me there. Ostentatious. What does ostentatious means? Look at the Latin source. Ostendam, I will show. What is an ostentatious person? What is an ostentatious person? Ostentatious. Very good, Sarah. A show off. Okay. An ostentatious person is a person who shows off. Good. Comes from the word ostendam. I shall show. Teacher says, I shall show to you all things, right? Very good. Then nominabo tibi omnia. Nominabo. I shall name for you all things. I shall name for you all things. So in other words, how am I going to learn this? The boy asks. And the teacher says, I'm going to lead you. I'm going to take you for a tour through the world. That's what we're going to do in this book. We're going to take a tour through the world. I'm going to show you everything, and I'm going to name everything for you. I'm going to show you things and teach you their names. That's the point of this book. It's a vocabulary book. So that's what the Magister says. Look at the word nominabo. Nominabo. Who can think of an English word that's drawn from nominabo? Good, Lara. Nominate. Nominative. Good, George. What does nominate mean? What does nominate mean? So if I say this actor was nominated for an award, does that mean that he won an award? To elect, to name, to choose, you're kind of getting close. George got it. It just means to be named. All right. So if we need to vote for a president, well, there's 300 million Americans. We can't vote, just for random people. So what we do is we nominate individuals. We name individuals and we set them up as the candidates, as the people who can be voted for. So to nominate just means to name someone, right? To give a name. You say, I nominate, Pete. I think he should be the class president. I nominate him. It just means to name someone. Nominabo. I shall name tibi omnia, for you all things. And then the boy responds and says, En ad sum. Duc me in nomine Dei. En ad sum. En is sort of an interjection. If you know what an interjection, it's just sort of like an expression, like, hey, look, ad sum, here I am. Ad sum means it's a combination of two words. It means I am at, or I am before you. Here I am. Ad sum. Duc me, lead me. Duc me in nomine Dei. Lead me in God's name. And again, in nomine Dei just means it's a phrase. In the name of God, it means, in agreement with God's will and with God's help. It's a response to when the Magister said, I will lead you cum Deo, with God's help. Okay? Then we've got this overview here by the Magister where he tells us what we're going to do first, and I'll show you what this means on the next pages. He says, ante omnia. So ante means before. Ante means before. Now, who can think of an English word that's drawn from ante? Ante. Antidote. No, that's actually drawn from a different word. Let me just type them real quick. That's good, George, but it's a different word. We have ante and anti, two different words, okay? Antidote comes from anti, which is different from ante. The word ant, like the insect ant, no, that doesn't come from ante. How about this? If I say that it's 10 o'clock in the morning, and I say AM, who knows what AM stands for? Who knows what AM stands for? Very good, very good, good. So ante meridian, that's good. Ante morning, that's that's not right, Josh. Ante meridiem is the Latin. Let me write it here. Ante meridiem is what it actually stands for. And what that means is before midday. Meri means middle and diem means day. So ante meridiem, AM means before midday. That A in AM is the Latin word ante, okay? So ante omnia, before all things. Before all things, debes dicere simplices sonos. Debes dicere simplices sonos. Debes means you ought. It's translated with Old English here, thou oughtest. Debes, you ought. So this stem deb, D-E-B, means to owe. To owe. So who can think of an English word that comes from this Latin word debes? Debt. Good. That comes from it. It means something that's owed. Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay. Debes. You ought. Dicere means to learn. We've already seen that verb. Dicere, another form. You ought to learn simplices sonos. Simplices sonos. It's translated as plain sounds. Plain sounds, but obviously simplices can be better translated as simple. Very good. I see some of you writing that. Simple sounds or plain sounds. And sonos is sounds. Sonos. So we have this stem son from Latin, which means sound. Who can think of an English word derived from the Latin word sonos? Sonar. Good. What is sonar, George? What does sonar mean? What does sonar mean? Sonar means to, yes, sound waves means to measure something with sound, right? So if we want to know how deep the ocean is, we can't see the bottom, we can't use light, we can't reach it, we can't measure it, but we can send a sound wave or a signal that will go down to the bottom of the ocean and bounce back up, and we can time how long it takes, so we can measure it with sonar measurement. Good, okay. Sonorous, Adel said sonorous. What does sonorous means? I think it's pronounced sonorous and not sonorous. What does that mean? Sonorous. What do you think that means? Snore is not right. You've got the letters mixed up. It definitely is a sound, but it's not son, it's snow. So good. You can think of some examples, okay? Sonos, sounds. So you ought to learn simple sounds. Ex quibus means of which or from which. You can see it translated of which. Sermo means speech. You can see it's in italics, and speech here is in italics. So sermo means speech. So what English word can you think of that is drawn from sermo? Pretty easy. Sermon, right? Sermon is a speech. That's an easy one. Sermo humanus. Humanus means human speech. Human speech. Okay. Constat means consists. So simple sounds from which human speech consists or is formed, right? Is stands together is what it literally means. Constat. Yeah, constant comes from the same word. Good. Humanus, obviously human. All right. If I say that something is, I'll type it here. Something is inhumane. Inhumane. What does inhumane mean? Unhuman. Good. You're acting in a way that's inhumane. You're not acting like a human, right? Usually means you're being like violent or insensitive. You're being inhumane. Good. So we go on. Quos animalia sciunt formare. Quos animalia sciunt formare. Which? Quos means which. Animalia is translated living creatures. Sorry, the highlighting doesn't always work. Living creatures, animalia. And animalia, the word animalia is actually derived from the Latin word anima. Who knows what anima means? Soul. Good. Good, Lara. Soul. So an animal is said to be a creature that has a soul, right? So even wild animals like horses and dogs and cows were said to have a certain kind of soul, not the same soul as a human, but a living soul. So living creatures are called animalia because they have souls. They're animated, right? Which animals sciunt formare. This word sciunt means they know. Sciunt, it's pronounced in Christian Latin, sciunt. But we see this little beginning here, SCI. Where have you seen that in English? SCI. Sciunt means they know. Good. Science. So what is science? What does the word science mean? What does science mean? Good. What does science mean? To know something. That's all it means. It means knowledge. All right. Comes from this verb, scire, which means to know. Which the animals know formare. Formare means to make. To make. Formare. To make. So if we know this verb here, formare, the stem form means make. We can think of a dozen English words that are drawn from formare. Who can think of an English word that's got that F-O-R-M in it? Formable, that's a good one. Formation, that's good. Forming, format, right? We can think of tons of them, okay? Formula, Good. All right. So it comes from the Latin verb formare, which means to make or to form. They use formare because the sounds are formed with the vocal organs, which the speech organs. Farmer, good. Farmer is not good. That's not from form. Formigas are ants in Spanish. That comes from the Latin word formica. Formica is the Latin word for ant. So that's a different word, not from forma, formica. Okay, so formare, to form, which animals know how to form. So we're going to study simple sounds, which out of which human speech consists, which animals are able to make. Et tua lingua scit imitari. Tua lingua means your tongue. So lingua means tongue in Latin. Lingua. So who can think of a word in English that comes from the Latin lingua? Lingua. Language is good, yeah. Linguistics. What is linguistics, Lara? What does that mean? What are linguistics? You can take a guess. Just try to make an intelligent guess. What are linguistics? How about if we say that someone is bilingual? What is bilingual? Yeah, linguistics is the study of language. What is bilingual? If I say that my friend is bilingual, yeah, he can speak 2 languages. Good. All right. So lingua means tongue. All right. So animals can form these sounds, and tua lingua scit imitari. That word scit comes from the same verb where we have sciunt. It means to know. Your tongue knows imitari. Imitari means to imitate. Okay. Your tongue can imitate these same sounds that the animals know how to make. Et tua manus potest pingere. Tua manus potest pingere. So we have tua, which means your, and then manus means hand. Manus means hand. So who can think of some words where this stem, man or manu, are used to form some English words? Manual, right? So a manual laborer. What is a manual laborer? To work with your hand, right? A manual laborer is a person who works with his hands. Good. As opposed to an intellectual, right? An intellectual is the opposite of a manual laborer, a person who works with his mind, intellectual. Good. So we have the word manus. Now, we saw in Latin reading the word factum, and here we have manu. So what does manufacture mean? What does manufacture mean? What does manufacture? Very good, Lara. To make by hand. To make by hand. Okay, manufacture, to make by hand. So tua manus, your hand, potest. Potest means is able. Okay, we see this stem pot, P-O-T, is able. It's translated can. Can means has the ability to. So pot, what pot refers to here in Latin is power, right? Power. You are able, you have the ability to do something, you have the power to do it. Your hand has the power, pingere, to picture out or to draw or to write. So think about this Latin stem pot. Pot means ability. Where do we see that in English? Potent, good. Potential. Potential means ability. Potent means powerful, right? If I say, this spice that you put in the food is very potent. It's very powerful. Potential means ability. Good. Right? That's very good. And then pingere is a verb here. Pingere means to picture out or to draw. Pingere. Pingere, to picture out or draw. I don't think we can think of any English words that are drawn from pingere, P-I-N-G. We can think of words that come from another form of pingere, which I don't want to talk about because I don't want to confuse you. But P-I-N-G, I can't think of any off the top of my head that come from pingere. But anyway, the Magister's long answer was ante omnia, before all things, debes dicere simplices sonos. You ought to learn simple sounds, ex quibus, out of which sermo humanus, human speech, consists. Quos animalia sciunt formare, which animals know to make, et tua lingua, and your tongue, shit imitari, knows to imitate, et tua manus, and your hand, potest, is able, pingere, to draw. Okay, so we're going to start ping pong. No, that's not right. Pin, it doesn't mean ping pong. Good guess though. Okay, so we've got this answer from the Magister. All right, so before we get started, he says we need to learn the sounds and letters of the language. And in grammar, this is called orthography. So what he's going to do is teach us the sounds of the Latin language by teaching us about different animal sounds. And we'll look at that in a minute. We've got a couple minutes left. Then he says, postea, afterwards, ibimus, we shall go, mundum, means to the world. Okay, so mundum means to the world. English word mundane. If something is mundane, what does mundane mean? If I say, you're so boring, all the topics you talk about are so mundane. George says worldly, that's right. Mundo is in Portuguese. Yep. Same word. Mundane means like boring, normal, worldly stuff. Like I want to think about sublime things, or I want to think about things that are heavenly or eternal or more beautiful than just ordinary everyday stuff. The stuff you talk about is mundane, boring, worldly. Okay? So we have mundum. If you're a soccer fan, you know what the Copa Mundial is. What's the Copa Mundial? I'm sure some of you know that, especially those of you with some Spanish background. It means the World Cup, right? Mundial means the world. Copa Mundial. So afterwards, we shall go into the world. We're going to go for a tour of the world and go look at things and name things. Et spectabimus omnia. Spectabimus means we shall view. We shall view. So we have this stem here in Latin, specta. Specta, which means to view or see something. We have spectacle. That's good, Sarah. Spectator is a person who views something. All right. To inspect. What does inspect mean? Inspect. Audrey, I don't know what that word is. Spectabular. You might have spelled it wrong. An inspector is someone who looks into something, who looks on something or looks into something. Okay? To inspect. And then we can think about a ton of different examples, right? What does it mean to expect? You might not understand this, but expect. To expect means to look out for something, right? Like I'm expecting dad to come home at any minute. So what am I doing? I'm looking out the window because I'm expecting dad to come home any minute, right? Expect actually means to look out for something. Okay, so that comes from spectabimus. We shall view all things. So we're going to take a tour through the world and look at all things. And then this last line, hic habes vivum et vocale alphabetum. Hic here means here. Hic here. Habes, you have. Vivum means living. Vivum, living. Et vocale, and vocal alphabet. Here you have a living and vocal alphabet. So he's going to go through this word. Vivo means living. In Spanish, again, since some of you have mentioned Spanish, you have aqua viva. What does aqua viva mean? Aqua viva. Yeah, viva la vida, right? Aqua viva means living water. Aqua viva, right? The water of life or living water. Means living water, all right? So here you have a living alphabet. If I say that someone is vivacious, if I say that a person is vivacious, what does that mean? Lively, very good, George. Okay, full of life, that's good. All right, so we see it comes from this Latin word vivum, which means living. And vocale, vocale means vocal. It means spoken, right? Vocal, living and vocal alphabetum. And the word alphabet, It refers to the list of all the letters of a language, and it just comes from the first two letters of the Greek, which are alpha and beta. So it's just AB. Alphabetum is the name for the list of the letters of a language. Okay, so there we have that first lesson. And then what I want you to see here, because this can be a little confusing, is you've got this wacky lesson that starts on the next page, and they show these pictures of animals or different things, and you've got a sentence, and then you've got these letters over here, and if you don't know what they're for, it's kind of confusing. But what the Magister just said is that all of the sounds of the letters can be found in among animals. And so what he does here is he uses this as a way of teaching pronunciation by using the sounds of different animals to represent the sounds of the different letters. So, for example, the first one is cornix cornicator. Cornix is the Latin for crow. So if you think of the sound that a crow makes, right? That sound, that's the sound of the Latin the Latin letter A. So we hear the sound of the letter A in the crow, in the crows crying. Next, agnus balat. Agnus is the Latin word for lamb, like agnus Dei, right? Agnus balat, and balat means to make that baaing sound, right, of the lamb. Be, be. So that's the second sound, the sound of the letter be, the sound of the lamb. Then you've got this insect. I don't know if you have these by you. They're called cicadas or cicadas. Some people call them cicadas. They make the chirping sound like cricket noises, chi, 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 chi. That's the sound of the consonant che in Latin. Then we've got another animal, upupa, which I don't think any of us are familiar with, but it makes the sound do, like the consonant de. So he goes through all of these different things. Maybe we'll look at this next week. Goes through all of these different animals or natural sounds and shows that they reveal to us the sound of the different letters. And we imitate these sounds, he says. We imitate these sounds in our language and draw them, right, with our hand. We draw them with our hand. That means we write the letters for these sounds. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. These sounds are imitated. These sounds, I'm sorry, are made by the animals or imitated by the animals. We can form them with our tongues, and we can write them with letters with our hand. And so in this couple of pages here, he goes through all the different animals and the sounds and how they apply to the alphabet. So it's just a strange way to teach the sounds of the alphabet, but entertaining, obviously, for kids. And remember, this was the first picture book ever made, so it was intended to be enjoyable for kids. Plus, it teaches us the names of all the different animals that we see here. You can see all the animals' names are in italics. So we learn we learn the name of Agnus for lamb. We learn Anser for goose. We learn Mus for mouse, Anas for duck, Lupus for wolf, Ursus for bear. We learn the names of all these common animals, Felis for cat, Pulus for a chick. That's the name for a chick. Then we've got Canis for dog, Serpens for serpent, Bubo for owl, Lepus for rabbit or hare, Rana for the frog, Asinus for the ass or donkey, Tabanus for the fly, the common annoying horsefly, and all their sounds we learn in that lesson. So anyway, that's how the vocabulary book works. We'll take a look at this pronunciation lesson maybe next week if you want to. If you understand it, we can ignore it, but maybe we'll take a look next week. Otherwise, we'll probably do a Latin reading lesson next week and then get back to this the following week. So anyway, it's already after 2:00. Our time's up. What I hope that you learn in this first lesson is, first of all, how the vocabulary lessons are to be studied, and how they help you to build and think about English words. So that's what I wanted to help you to appreciate today. That's all that I want to talk about. So if you're ready to move on in your day, you can go at this time. If you have any questions or would like to talk about this stuff, I'll hang out here and talk about it as long as you want. So If you're leaving, I'll see you next time. And if you've got some questions or want to chat about any of this stuff more, I'll hang out and we'll just chat on the text chat. Okay. Thanks for coming. Sorry if that was 5,000 miles an hour through the lesson, but I just wanted to get through that so everyone knows how these vocab lessons work and how they can help you. Okay. So I'll catch you guys next week. Anybody want to chat here? Just fire away with any questions. If you got questions about vocabulary, this kind of stuff, English words, things like that, we could talk about that stuff. So feel free to ask any questions you have. Thank you all for coming. Any Latin vocab questions? And remember, we have, I don't know if we have it open yet, but we have the same exact course for Greek because this same book was translated into Greek, so you can use it to learn Greek vocabulary. What does the abbreviation "no" as a number mean? That's a good question. What does the abbreviation NO for number mean? That's a good question. I think that's a challenge for us. The Latin is numerus, so it's obviously not an abbreviation for the word number. Okay. I don't know. I'd have to look that up. NO period. Okay. Good question. So you asked one question and stumped me. That figures. A good place to look that up, you might find that in the Oxford Dictionary. It might tell you where that came from. If you don't know, any of you guys in the academy, you can go to oed.com. And of course, you need your parents' permission, but oed.com, you can use the username and password OED. I think it's lowercase. OEDCLAA is the username and password for the Oxford Dictionary. That's the best dictionary. No, Zoriana, we're not here to see your manufactured flowers. Questions about vocabulary? Any other vocab questions? Any other vocab questions? Do I recommend any other Latin vocab books? Yeah, there are a bunch. There are a bunch of older vocab books. I don't think any of them are as easy to use as this one, even though it's an old book. There are lots of old books. If you're into finding old books online, there are old books, especially written by some Jesuits, where they had like fake discussions between students, and they would use those discussions to learn vocabulary. The kids would study the discussions and learn all the vocab. There's a famous old book called The Colloquies of Corderius. I just typed it in the box there. Corderius' Colloquies. That's one book you can look up. There's another one, Sententiae Pueriles is another book. I think that might be made by a Latin teacher named Charles Houle. So there are some old books you can find, old copies of them. That were old, that were used for teaching vocabulary. Let me see if I can find one real quick for you. I'll show you what it looks like. Give me a second. You can find all of this stuff on the archive.org website, where they've just got zillions of old books scanned in and available. Give me 1 second. I'll see if I can find one real quick. Sententiae Pueriles. Yeah, Sententiae Pueriles is by a writer named Coleman. Yeah, that's it. Corderii Colloquia. That's the book I'm talking about. That's good. That's the right one. So let me just open this up 1 second. Yeah, Corderius's Colloquies. Corderius was a Jesuit teacher. Let me share my screen real quick and I'll show you one of these old books. You should be able to see this on your screen. You see, this is an old one. It's called Sententiae Pueriles, which means, we just learned that word puerile, right? Which means childish. So sentences for children. You can see the English translation here, Sentences for Children, written by Charles Houle, or I think it was written by Coleman and then later translated into English by Charles Houle. But what you'll see in this book, Sententiae Pueriles, is just tons of phrases, simple phrases translated into English. So it's just a source of hundreds and hundreds of Latin phrases and their English meanings, which is a good way to learn some more vocabulary. So if you're really into Latin vocabulary studies, Sententiae Pueriles is a good source. That book you have, the dialogues or colloquies of Corderius are good. So there's other stuff like that, but this book we're studying, Comenius's book, was really like the most popular Latin vocabulary book, which is why I like to start with it. Okay. So lots of sources for that stuff. All right. Any other questions? So that's good. Yeah, you can, there's lots of Latin vocabulary sources. Now, the reason why, like some people like to, like they try to teach like what they call living Latin classes in modern times, that's not a good idea, because what we really have to learn, we really have to learn what words people used when Latin was actively spoken. That's what we have to learn. We can't just string words together from a dictionary. That's why these old books are better, because when these books were made, Latin was actively in use. It was used in the church, it was used in government, it was used in universities and schools. It was used by lawyers and courts. So when they tell us how to say something, it's because that's how they actually said it. It was still in practice, you know. We don't want to rely on a dictionary knowledge of the language. Okay. Anything else before we wrap up here today? Any other questions? What about Greek vocab books? Yeah, same thing. I don't know if I can find this for you real quick. Let me see if I've got it. 1 second. Let me just check my stuff that I have. I had a copy of Comenius, this same book in Greek. You can find it. Let me just check real quick. There are a couple sources. One, I'll share this with you if I can find it. I've got to think. Array trilingual. Here's one I'll show you real quick. Let me share my screen. Here's a book. It's called a trilingual nomenclator. You can figure out what that means. Nomenclator means a book of names, which is basically like a dictionary, but it's trilingual. So it's for 3 languages. It's English, Latin, and Greek. So what's cool about this book is if you look at it, it's got vocabulary lists, and it'll have the English word and then have the Latin word for that English word, and then have the Greek word for that English word. So you've got the English, Latin, and Greek. You can learn all 3 vocabulary items together. Now, the problem with this book is that for most of you guys, they use Greek writing here that is almost like secret code. You'd have to learn what all these symbols mean and stuff like that. So I would, for me to teach this book in our program, I would have to type out all those words so that you could read them simply, which would take some time. But you know, there are sources like this that are really helpful. Again, this is called Trilingual Nomenclator, and I can give you a link to this because it's on the CLA website. 1 second, if you're really interested. That book is on the CLA website. So that's a good source, and there's stuff like that. And then there's also, if I go back to archive.org here, I might be able to find Comenius in Greek. Let me just check real quick. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, here it is. Orbis Pictus, same book. Same book, Comenius's book in Greek and Latin. Just expand this a little bit. So same book, I'll show you as we get. So there's no pictures in this one, but if you look at it, it's the same lesson. So kosmos in Greek, in Latin it's mundus, and they give you the Greek and Latin form. So if you learn Comenius in Latin, you can then use that to learn Greek. So, there's ways to learn this stuff. Lots of resources, thanks to all this technology that gives us all this stuff, but plenty of resources. If you're eager to learn the languages, the resources are endless, Okay. So that's also on and you saw I just searched for Comenius Greek, right? And I found it. So if you just do a search like that, you can find it. Anything else? Any other questions? We did the modern courses and they did not work. Latin is a dead language and they teach it like it's alive. Yeah, I just don't think that's a good idea to try to, the people who claim to teach Latin in like a living language class, first of all, they're usually not experts in Latin, really. And second, how do we even know that what they're teaching you to say is true Latin? So when you turn around and try to read something, you can't read, which is proof that you're not learning Latin. So I would rather learn Latin by reading. I think it's better for us. I think teachers do that just to sort of, first of all, it's a good way to make money, and second of all, no one can. They're not accountable to anybody because nobody knows the language, so they can say whatever they want and kind of get away with it. In translation, it's not that easy. You're accountable to the text, and there's usually English translations available. Yeah, words for modern things. It just gets silly too, because they just start like sticking words together, and it gets kind of weird. Now there is an interesting source if you're just like nerdy and interested in messing with something like this. There is I don't know if you know this, but if you know what the website Wikipedia is, there's a website, a version of it. There's a version of it. And, if I give you a link, you need to ask your parents' permission, but there's a Latin website called Wikipedia, which is like Wikipedia. It's a form of Wikipedia, but it's all in Latin. So if you wanted to get into any like modern Latin news or anything like that, there's a couple of sources that you could use, but I just don't think that's helpful. Really, we want to learn Latin so that we can read ancient works. And I think the best way to do that is by translation exercise. All right, so that's just sort of a fun resource, but they're not serious. All that modern stuff is usually just goofy. Like they have books like Cat in the Hat and The Hobbit in Latin. We shouldn't waste our time with that stuff. We want to learn the old stuff. Anything else? All right. Yeah, thank you, George. Thanks for all the questions. Good stuff. And we'll get into Greek. I think I'm going to have a Greek live class. Once my schedule calms down a little bit, I'll post an announcement, and we'll maybe like Thursday or Friday, we'll have a Greek class available. So I'm going to wrap up for today. I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for all the questions. Get these assignments done, get through these lessons, turn your assignments in, and let's move through these courses. All right. I'll see you guys later. God bless.